Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Brushes and Bunnies, and this is the very first video to my official watercolor tutorial series. In this video, I'm going to be giving you guys an easy walkthrough for all of the watercolor basics and also the must-haves. Please note this is mostly just for materials and things that you should consider before getting started into watercolor. The next episode of the series, we're going to be focusing on the actual watercolor techniques, and we're going to be talking more about that in the upcoming videos. So without further ado, let's get started. Number one, we're going to be talking about watercolor paper. It's actually very easy. There are primarily three different types of watercolor papers. You have hot press, cold press, and rough. The paper type that I use the most is actually hot press paper, and basically hot press is very smooth. When you touch it, there is no grain to it, there's no texture. Typically when you think of watercolor paper, you think of a paper that has more like bumps and grooves in it, but the hot press, if you want to avoid this, you can get hot press, and it's very soft. It's like silk almost. This is really wonderful if you're doing a lot of detailed work in your watercolor. The next paper type is cold press, and cold press I do use a lot as well. Cold press does offer more of a texture to it, so when you rub your fingers against it, you're going to feel more bumpy texture to it. If you want to get that nice texture in your watercolor art but don't want to use rough paper, I would then suggest to use the cold press paper. As for the rough, I barely use rough, but lately I've been using more of it just because I think it's actually kind of fun to draw and paint on a rough paper. When you rub your fingers against it, you're going to feel a lot of bumps, a lot of texture, and this paper is a bit harder to get more detailed work, especially if you're working with mixed media and pencils. If you're combining watercolor and pencils together, I would suggest using the hot press. Now, in terms of brands out there, I love these two brands, Arches and Hahnemuller. They're both really good, but they're also both very expensive. So if you're looking to get started into it, just go for any sort of cheap brand that's out there, just if you're getting started, and get familiar with the different paper textures, different types of paper that you would like to work on. And then once you know for sure, you can proceed with buying the big stuff, which is a little bit more expensive. In addition to watercolor paper, you can also use sketchbooks. There are so many sketchbooks out there that offer different types of watercolor paper. For example, this is a cold press sketchbook, and you can basically just hold all of your work within the sketchbook and practice watercolors. I would definitely recommend getting a watercolor sketchbook before you invest in any papers, just because you can experiment already, so you don't have to use your expensive papers to experiment. Number two, we're going to talk about watercolor brushes. There are so many things out there that you can buy in terms of brushes. There are different sizes, there are different shapes in terms of having a flat brush or having a round brush or having a pointed tip. There are so many things out there that you can basically buy and try out with. Now, in terms of must-haves for brushes, I would definitely recommend getting brushes that are very pointed, very thin for small detailed work. I would recommend getting brushes that are flat, so you can get a flat surface if you just want to do a flat wash of watercolor. And I would also recommend getting some that are like this one, that are rounded but pointed at the tip. This is really good if you want to cover a large mass of paper, or if you want to do some detail work. These brushes work very well. And also, just as a tip, when you're going to the art store and you go to the brush section, usually the brushes are organized based on the type of paint that you'll be using. If you want to do oil or acrylic or watercolor, usually they're categorized based on this. So definitely look out for those that are for watercolor or aquarelle, however you call them in your language, but definitely look out for these guys, for watercolor brushes. Number three, we're going to talk about the watercolor paint. I won't go into so much detail. I'll probably have to do a second video of this, but basically there are two types of paints that you can buy for watercolor. You can buy these little pans here. They sell them in a small size, and they also sell them in a medium size, and I believe you can also get bigger sometimes, so it really depends on the art store. But you can get pans or you can get tubes. Now usually in terms of my experience with buying watercolor paints, the tubes are a little bit more expensive than the actual pans. I don't really have a recommendation for this. I like using both. I started off with the pans and I think they work wonderful. These were the first pans that I bought and they're still in use today, and this is probably about like 4 years old maybe. And so they're quite old, and you can see that they last a long time, which is really great for the price that they are at. In terms of the watercolor paints, I will be dedicating another video to this because there's a lot to talk about. I really want to get in depth in terms of selecting your first watercolor set, which brands to use, which brands you can use if you're a beginner and don't want to spend so much money on watercolor paint, and basically how to set up your first palette as well. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be available in another episode of this watercolor tutorial series. The next thing that's a must-have are palettes. So definitely invest in these different types of palettes. There are plastic ones, there are glass ones, there are metal ones. Invest in this, get yourself a couple of them. They are rather cheap actually. I have all kinds. This is just a very small collection of what I have, but these are super useful, especially when you want to mix your colors together. You want to have a place to put down all of your watercolor paints. Definitely you need one of these kind of trays or these palettes. What's really nice with watercolor is that once you put paint in the palette, you can just reuse it by adding watercolor, so it's not like acrylic where it will dry very quickly, and that's the beauty of watercolor, which I really love. So anything you have on these palettes you can definitely reuse and use for a very long time. The next element that is a must-have is actually masking tape. You can get these at your local art store or even at your hardware store in the paint section. This is definitely useful if you're planning on having a border, for example, around your watercolor painting. Then you can just use the masking tape and kind of tape that section off so the paint will not go on that piece of paper. The masking tape or the painter's tape is also super useful for just kind of locking your paper down on the surface, so on a board or on the table. When you're wanting to do a full background of watercolor, you're gonna have to lock this down by adding tape onto the paper and basically taping it to the surface. And what this will help with is to avoid any sort of buckling. And to avoid any buckling, you can just tape your paper down with the masking tape or the painter's tape and it will remain very straight. The next item is actually paper towels. Now, I use paper towels like crazy, and it's definitely a must-have when you're doing watercolor. When you're putting your brush into the water and you've got excess water, you can just dab that water off. If you've got paint on your brush and you've got a little too much paint, you can also just dab that paint off before you apply it onto the paper. It's a super useful tool, especially if you need to take any excess water off of your brush or any excess paint, for example. If you've got too much excess paint on your paper, you can simply just dab it right off. The next item is a clean cup of water. Now this one is a bit dirty because of the paint that I used yesterday with it, but essentially just having a cup of water, you definitely need one if you're going to be doing watercolor. Some artists use 2 cups. You've got one with dirty water, you've got one with clean water, just to alternate between having a clean brush and a dirty brush as well. But I just use 1 cup of water, and that's basically all I really need it for. And honestly, you don't need so much water just to get started with it. We're gonna be doing a more in-depth tutorial about this, but essentially you just dab a bit of water and you add it to your paint. Another must-have is to have a test paper with you, and this is something that I do for every painting that I have or that I create. I always have a watercolor test paper next to me so I can just try out the colors, try out the combinations, try out the blending of the colors, just to see if it looks good before I apply it on the actual paper. Now for the test papers, I'm just using a paper that I don't really like as much, that I bought a long time ago, and I have so many of them, so I'm just using one of these, and it is actually a rough paper, so it does have a bit of a texture to it, but it doesn't really matter because I'm just using it for a color test. So I definitely advise for you guys to get yourself one of these sort of test papers next to you, and you can just have it right next to you while you're painting, and it definitely helps to avoid any unnecessary mistakes. I hope that this video has helped you, especially if you're starting out in watercolor. Please stay tuned for other videos. I will be releasing a lot of them in terms of this watercolor series or this watercolor tutorial series. I have a lot of things planned and I'm really excited to start something new on this YouTube channel, and I hope you guys will like it too. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything specific you want me to show you, then I will consider and add it to the series. That being said, I wish you guys a lovely Sunday. Keep drawing, keep painting, never give up, keep being awesome, and we will see each other next week. Bye!